Hello, and welcome again to our week 4 review of some items. We've got a lot of items to cover this week in our conversation. And the first thing I'd like to cover uh, is our critical analysis. I just remind you to please sign up for your critical analysis. Remember, the paper is due on the day you sign up. So if you sign up for an article on September 18th, like the Jervis article, the paper is due then with the guidelines in Moodle, and the presentation is due the day before, and we have some good example now in Moodle for an excellent presentation. So this week we cover realism, neorealism, liberalism, neoliberalism, and constructivism. And I know this was a heavy week of reading, but they really are the three sort of main theories, in addition to radicalism, which we are going to start to cover next week, particularly Marxism. But I want to point out very quickly that John Mearsheimer is sort of the granddaddy of realist thought. He's at University of Chicago. And in fact, I just put a more recent article that he wrote on why it's the West's fault that Russia is in Ukraine. It's a very controversial article. There's been a lot of buzz about it on the web. I encourage you to read it and look at it and think about it. But his perspective is very realist. He argues power is military. And if you look at what Russia has been saying, they've been saying that they don't want NATO expansion, and the U.S., because it looks maybe in too liberal of a perspective regarding norms and democracy, it looks for those issues rather than realpolitik, what states are vying for power. The U.S. has made a mistake, a miscalculation. In any event, in his article regarding the Cold War, for Mearsheimer, the best times in the world were the times when we had bipolar, what he would call peace, balance of power, two main powers. And for him, he argues, we're going to miss the Cold War. They were happy days. Why? Because there was a balance of two identifiable powers which both had large nuclear weapons. And so he talks about deduction as using deduction from history to deduce the future. And as you read in the article, he uses the cases of Athens and Sparta and the Cold War. He also talks about nuclear weapons because he refers to the Cold War and how important those nuclear weapons were. He argues, and his prescription for policy based on his balance of power approach is that as the Cold War ends, the US and the UK need to manage nuclear weapons and encourage everyone to have them in a managed system. That's obviously very controversial. In fact, my professor from graduate school, George Quester, was one of his colleagues who agreed with that thought. And I'm not sure that some today wouldn't say that Mearsheimer and Quester were right in the sense that nuclear weapons now are possibly in the hands of non-state actors. We know A.Q. Khan, for example, in Pakistan, was selling nuclear materials, and he is an individual, not even a state actor. But I just want to point out that I call these softies or soft theories of liberals that Mearsheimer points out in his article, and this is the X causes Y. So he argues that the thought of history of conflict will cause peace, he says, which is ridiculous. That, in fact, wars have occurred again and again and again, even after known brutalities. And that economic trade will cause peace. He says the false assumption there is that prosperity alone will motivate action, and that democracies will cause peace. I know we read Francis Fukuyama, that was our discussion for the week. Fukuyama disagrees, obviously, with Mearsheimer. And again, I mentioned his prescriptions. And we have an article, you can click on, by the way, this link. There's a great video of Fukuyama. Now, a neo-realist like Waltz, that you also read for this week, argues that unlike Mearsheimer that uses deduction and very robust, rich historical analysis, Waltz argues that neorealism is more of a science and that he compares it more to the natural sciences. So for him, creating a theory is a construction that allows us, much like the natural science, to base it on assumptions and isolate variables. And he argues Adam Smith did this. He created some suppositions and he had no data. But he says that he wants to go even further with data. And so here for Waltz, I think you can see the differences I lay out on the screen. But the main difference, aside from the deductive-inductive approach, is that for a neorealist, power is a dynamic, not a static variable. So power can change based on how they define power, economic, military, or political. And also, then the structure of the international system based on a balance of power is the unit of analysis. So the state is what's static, and the structure changes based on power levels that fluctuate. So who are the great powers, who are the lesser powers, who are the rising powers, and who is the hegemon, and who are the declining. Now, Bill Richardson takes a real different twist, I have to say, on realism, and some people very much disagree with him. He argues that a new realism for the 21st century has to talk about ideology and ideals. He talks about effective leadership as finding common ground and interests with others. And he talks about not only military power, but also international law, human rights, and civil liberties. That sounds a lot to many as if his new realism is actually liberal institutionalism or Fukuyama's liberal democracy. So you have to be the judge of that. But Bill Richardson, just to point out, was a Republican candidate in the primary opposing Mitt Romney for the last election. So he made it very far in the election cycle, and so his theory has some traction. Okay, I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint slide, and I want to apologize that I'm going to be moving relatively quickly, but I want to move also to classical liberalism and neoliberalism. And essentially for Michael Doyle, he talks about thoughts on liberalism, about protecting rights, about elections and democracies, a cosmopolitanism, meaning a world governance system that creates a perpetual, like Kant's perpetual peace. And here he argues against our thoughts on destroying ourselves, and that the only way to see the world is through capitalist rationalism. He argues that even Machiavelli, in fact, admitted that you have to create cooperation to guarantee the survival of the state and citizens. And he argues that the absence of war among liberal states, among democracies, will create more of a perpetual peace, a desire for that peace. And the balance of power then will be preventing war rather than a balance of power based on conflict. And so for Michael Doyle, much like realists, classical realists, he uses history and philosophy to define what his theory is. Now, neoliberal institutionalists, much like classical or much like neo-realists, argue that, well, wait a minute, there's a science here. And in fact, the science has a lot to do with economics and the prisoner's dilemma. If you look at the C as cooperation and the D as defection, a realist will tell you, well, you see a D in 75% of the cases, meaning the actor, the state, is going to defect from some type of cooperative agreement. So why would we cooperate if we know in 75% of the cases, almost all the cases, the state is not going to cooperate, going to defect? Yet a neoliberal institutionalist would look at this and say, well, hang on. Also in 75% of the cases is the ability to cooperate. And so that cooperation motivated through the same self-interest, but self-interest mean in preservation, but self-interest to cooperate, because it is in a state self-interest to cooperate. And so here, neoliberals talk about regimes like the World Trade Organization or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, rather. Regimes are groupings of ideas, norms, and principles that form institutions. They can be formal, they can be informal. Even like FIFA for soccer or football is a regime. It has ideas, norms, principles. It has FIFA, the institution. It has rules that are implemented. And so it's the structure of these institutions and the penal code within them that penalizes actors when they don't cooperate that is necessary according to Robert Cohane and Joseph Nye being the dean of the School of Government at Harvard. And so for them, this is what governs the international system, the implementation of rules and how those rules are institutionalized to penalize actors that defect rather than going into conflict. And so, of course, this behooves a conversation on international law and international cooperative alliances and institutions. So, thinking of right now moves with NATO and the fact that most recently today, France announced that it too will join NATO action with ISIS or ISIL, depending on what you want to call them, in the Iraq-Syria area. And so if one is attacked, all are attacked, and that the penal code will be if you don't work with NATO, then when you are attacked, the rest of the NATO members may not reinforce and defend you. And so there's also the thought of hegemonic stability, meaning that the large power, when the large power participates in these institutions, it creates more gains. There's an advantage to having them participate because others will follow. And so the concept really for Cohane and Nye is that when they looked at the world with the World Trade Organization and the World International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they saw many cooperative efforts that were diverting conflict toward cooperation. And so the question is, when we hear, for example, the president talk about cooperative alliances and working through international legal channels and through diplomatic institutions such as the United Nations and the UN Security Council, Mearsheimer, as a classical realist, would argue that's ridiculous. The only power that matters is a balance of power through military power. Yet, groups of scholars like Cohane and Nye, neoliberal institutionalists, will say, well, wait a minute, self-interest can be defined through cooperative efforts because it's in the state's interest to cooperate with other states. And so those are the two primary differences. And lastly, I would like to talk about Alexander Wendt, and I won't drag on too much about it because you had a presentation this week on it, only to say that for Wendt, anarchy, the supposition that there's no government that controls and makes a structure in the international system, so states have to do that. For Wendt, that's really incorrect. He argues that it's the process of behaviors and interactions and norms that motivate structural change, not the rational action of states. He says the entire optic is incorrect. And then I'd like to look also, and you can look at these slides. I know that many of you probably watch the Game of Thrones. I don't, but I thought it would be fun for you to read. And what's interesting is Charlie Carpenter argues that power, say as conceived by John Mearsheimer as military, is not enough. That the little people in the Game of Thrones are actually in some powerful positions at times. That the norms that rule those societies are quite important. Behaviors, you have to work within a certain behavioral structure. And she argues that realism ignores the planetary limits that we have for carbon emissions or natural resource finite natural resources. And finally, she argues that realism focuses on short-term self-interested objectives, where in Game of Thrones, that type of self-interest produces usually the chaos. And that's a real turn of events on the concept of power from realism. And so that concludes my overview of the main readings, and we discussed Fukuyama online, so I won't talk more about the end of history, only to say that he clearly, strongly supports the democratic peace theory and argues that that really is, liberal democracy really is the end game system for the planet. And I look forward to reading your posts. Thanks so much.